This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, your firm has been on a tear lately. You've all brought a whole new raft of lawsuits across the country using lesser known parts of the Voting Rights Act that'll have major implications for voting rights. So, first off, let's look at the ever important state of Wisconsin. Can you talk about the new federal lawsuit in that state?
One of the challenges we've been dealing with in Wisconsin since the 2020 election has been high rates of absentee ballot rejection. And the biggest reason, one of the biggest challenges that voters in Wisconsin have is that they don't just need to sign their own absentee ballot envelope, but they need to get it witnessed and signed by someone else. And there have been all kinds of inconsistent guidance and inconsistent standards applied to how that witness certification takes place. And so we are challenging that because in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the Congress passed a law to prevent what's called vouching. One of the ways Jim Crow worked was to prevent Black voters from registering and voting by requiring that they have a voucher, someone who is already a registered voter vouch for their character and their eligibility to vote. This was a way to prevent newly Black voters from being able to register and to be able to vote. So Congress specifically struck down vouching requirements under Section 201 of the Voting Rights Act. And what we have in Wisconsin with these witness requirements, and by the way, it's not just Wisconsin, are essentially vouching requirements. What is the witness doing? The witness is vouching that you are the person you say you are. And so we filed a federal lawsuit to strike down this requirement for a witness to vouch for the voter. If that is successful, it will have dramatically positive consequences for the voters of Wisconsin and ultimately around the country.
Man, it's crazy when you hear about the past, when you hear about the past of this stuff and how the laws that are being enacted right now are so similar, have those roots in the past. That shows just how insidious this stuff is and how not much has changed as far as, these racist laws in the South to prevent people from voting really are. Mark, is there any way to tell how many voters have been disenfranchised by this requirement, or how many voters' ballots were rejected as a result of this in Wisconsin?
Yeah, this may sound like one of these small picky things. It's really not. It affects a lot of voters. So there was an audit in 2021 in Wisconsin, and it found that almost 7% of all mail-in ballots had some issue, some potential challenge that could lead to disenfranchisement relating just to this issue of witness certification. This is the reason why, if you go to democracydocket.com and you look at the cases, you will see all of these cases in state court in Wisconsin that deal with various aspects of this witness. What if the witness fills out their street address but doesn't put their zip code? What if they don't put their street address but they do put their zip code? What if they abbreviate their town? What if they leave out the state Wisconsin? There's all these lawsuits because these standards for these witnesses have been so hard for people to follow and comply with, and there have been inconsistent standards. So a 7% potential rejection rate is a huge problem for voting rights there. In 2022, there were several thousand ballots that were rejected just on this ground. So this will be a big, big case for what could be a very closely divided electorate in the state of Wisconsin in 2024.
Right. It's worth noting too that Joe Biden won Wisconsin over Donald Trump by like 0.6 of a point in 2020. So this is not a state where you can just allow yourself to cast off a few thousand ballots because of some innocuous issue, an issue that was put in place on purpose expressly to be able to suppress voters. Mark, if having to complete your ballot in front of a witness, for example, falls under the Voting Rights Act under the grounds of there being some type of a test, then wouldn't mandating voter ID also pose a similar problem as far as the Voting Rights Act is concerned? Because ID isn't free, meaning that making it a prerequisite to vote could mean that could mean that it's an economic barrier to actually casting your ballot.
So I don't think we know yet. I mean, one of the things that I think your introduction got exactly right is that all of the cases we're talking about now are new applications, frankly, of provisions of the Voting Rights Act that have either never been litigated before or have been under litigated. So they're just underdeveloped areas of the law. Like the vouching requirement didn't come up a lot after the Voting Rights Act was passed because most states had to drop their voucher requirements for other reasons. So what we are trying to do in bringing these lawsuits is to breathe new life into these laws, make a real positive change for voters, and also create a template, hopefully, that if we're successful, that others could bring other kinds of challenges by developing the law in a positive way. And voter ID may be one of those areas.
And by the way, my next question was going to be why hasn't this issue been? I mean, we're talking about the Voting Rights Act. This is going back more than 50 years. Why hasn't this been litigated? Why has it been under litigated? And I guess the answer I was going to get, which I don't know if you'd say it, but I'll say it, is because we haven't had firms like yours coming forward and bringing these lawsuits. So with that said, for people watching right now, if you want to support Marc and his team, please make sure to sign up for Democracy Docket. That's a great way to support them. It's the news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting and elections. The link is right here on the screen. Marc, let's go to another swing state that you've been heavily involved in. That's Georgia. Can you talk about the lawsuit related to absentee ballot deadlines?
Yeah, so this is a provision of the Voting Rights Act that has literally never been litigated. Okay, so we have underdeveloped and then we have never developed. And this is section 202D of the Voting Rights Act that says that in years in which you have a presidential election, voters have to be able to cast an absentee ballot if they applied 7 days in advance for an absentee ballot. This was actually put in the law to protect young voters. People don't realize, but part of the Voting Rights Act amendments in 1970 were really aimed at dealing with a series of voter suppression laws aimed at young voters. And so the 70 Amendment were trying to improve the lot of young voters. Ultimately, it led to the enactment of a new constitutional amendment, the 26th Amendment, lowering the age of voting. But before that, this provision was put in the law to make sure that people are not disenfranchised by not applying for an absentee ballot weeks and weeks or months and months in advance. So it says that you can't impose these long periods to require application for an absentee ballot. Georgia SB 202, that big voter suppression law we've talked about before, well, guess what? It put in place a requirement that you have to apply for an absentee ballot 11 days before election day. So this is, again, a provision that's in the law, should be straightforward, should reduce the barriers, make it easier for people to apply for absentee ballots and be able to vote in the elections in Georgia. And if we're successful here, there are lots of other states that have followed Georgia's example that could see their laws challenged as well.
And do you expect this to be resolved in time for 24?
100%. All of the lawsuits we're talking about now are being litigated to be resolved in plenty of time for people to vote in 2024.
Okay, moving over to yet another important swing state that we've been especially focused on lately, that's North Carolina. Can you speak about the lawsuit there?
Yeah, so this is a really, really important lawsuit. Nationally, it's an important lawsuit in North Carolina. And again, it involves a provision of the Voting Rights Act that has never been litigated. So one of the things in 1970, when Congress was doing the amendments to the Voting Rights Act, was they were really worried about what was going to happen to young voters, and particularly young voters who were moving around a lot, who were not necessarily going to be in one place a long time before election day. And so Congress wanted to make clear that there is no acceptable state durational requirement for voting. Let me say that again so that everybody out there hears this. There is no minimum number of days you need to live somewhere before being eligible to vote in that place for presidential elections. Our lawsuit says it applies to all elections, not just presidential elections, but Congress's law spells out in no uncertain terms that states cannot require you to be a resident someplace for a certain number of days before voting for president. So North Carolina law requires that you be a resident of the state for 30 days before being eligible to vote. That is absolutely in violation of this provision of the Voting Rights Act, never litigated before, but being litigated now in North Carolina. Now, Brian, why is this so vital? This is vital because North Carolina, as you know, has a same-day registration requirement or same-day registration allowance for the final days before the election. So someone could same day register in North Carolina. And if this durational requirement is allowed to exist, they're not allowed to vote. And so what I'm here to tell the people of North Carolina is help's on the way. We are going to strike down this durational requirement so that whether you are registering, whether you're registering 20 days before the election or you're registering doing same-day registration during the early vote process, you're going to be allowed to vote.
To that point, I think that's not too dissimilar to what we're seeing out of Washington. I think your lawsuit is also bringing a lawsuit in the not in a state that we wouldn't normally expect you to bring a lawsuit in. That's Washington. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, so we brought a very, very similar lawsuit in Washington for the same reasons, which is that Washington also has a durational residency requirement. And these durational residency requirements are simply disenfranchisement laws. And whether they are in blue states or purple states or red states, they are equally pernicious. There is no reason why someone who moves to a jurisdiction that has either same-day registration or allows registration closer than 30 days before the election, there is no reason why they should have their right to vote taken away from them. You know, the Constitution doesn't condition the right to vote on how long you live somewhere. Now, you have to be a resident of the place. I'm not saying, before all the haters and the right-wingers out there saying, Marc Elias thinks you should be able to vote anywhere in the country you want. No, you have to be a resident. But there's nothing magical about living someplace for 30 days or 20 days or 15 days. If that's where you live, it's where you live. And so we're suing Washington State as well. I am hoping that Washington State, I'm hoping North Carolina won't fight us on this, and they'll just agree to invalidate their law, repeal their law, whatever is necessary. And because that would be the simplest way of resolving this. But one way or another, we're going to get results.
Just a quick procedural question here. When you sue a state that might otherwise be sympathetic to what you're suing them for, is it faster, for example, for you to sue and then be forced to repeal a certain law through the courts? And is that why you do it, as opposed to having them kind of go through the regular legislative process to repeal and replace a certain law?
Look, here's the thing. If I think there's an opportunity for a legislature to change a law, I'd much rather they change the law. Right. I obviously I'd rather going to court is never my first option. My first option is to use opportunities like this to speak out and call things out, to use opportunities to identify problems. I write regularly on Democracy Docket about laws that should be changed. Every state right now that has a ballot challenge law that allows private citizens, Republican vigilantes, to challenge the eligibility of people to vote, they should change those laws. Okay. And when we later sue over them, I don't want to hear, well, you didn't give us a chance to repeal the law. I've told you, change the law. Washington State allows that, by the way. And so I usually try to call it out first, but ultimately we go to court because the courts are the arbiter of whether something is constitutional or not. But Washington State still has a choice. Washington State has the choice. They can fight this lawsuit, or they can agree and either just enter into a settlement and say, yep, we're no longer going to enforce the law, or they call the legislature into session and have the legislature change the law. But you know, one way or another, we cannot allow voting rights to be sacrificed because states have these old laws and are unwilling to do what's necessary to see that they are repealed or otherwise done away with.
All right, well, seems like the perfect place to leave off. I mentioned at the top that it was your firm that brought these lawsuits, so thank you to you and your team. And for everybody watching, if you want to support Marc and his team, please sign up for Democracy Docket. Again, it's the free news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting in elections. The link is right here on the screen. It's also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.